I'm pleased to introduce the Head of Research at the Nordic Africa Institute, Professor Eleanor Fisher.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Well, welcome everyone from the Nordic Africa Institute here in Sweden to this virtual book launch of the Anthropology of Resource Extraction, edited by Dr. Lorenzo D'Angelo of La Sapienza University of Rome and Dr. Robert Pipers, University of Hamburg, Germany. After their introduction, Robert and Lorenzo will introduce the authors contributing to this book launch. I know many of you have joined today. I would, however, like to welcome our discussants, Professor Jerry Jacka, University of Colorado, and Professor Jessica Smith, Colorado School of Mines. Thank you very much for joining us. The topic of resource extraction and the roles played by resources in contemporary society, economy, and geopolitics is close to our research interests at the Nordic Africa Institute. So we very much welcome debate on how actors use, manage, and think about resources. It's with particular pleasure for me personally that I welcome you to this book launch, because both Robert and Lorenzo, and also author contributors Cristiano Lanzano and Sabine Luning, are part of a project, Gold Matters, on sustainability transformations in artisanal and small-scale gold mining, which I lead. And it's been wonderful to see the volume take shape and become realized. I was remembering today that in March 2019 was our first workshop from the project. And I remember us sitting at the table and Routledge had approached the editors and asked them if they were interested in producing a volume. So it's wonderful to see the results of a lot of labor that have taken place over the last 3 years between the editors and the author contributors. I also note that Robert is a past recipient of Nordic Africa Institute's Early Career Researcher Scholarship Programme and has spent time with us here in Uppsala. So it's very, very nice to track the career journeys of people who have come to us at the Institute. I promise not to take valuable time from the programme by speaking myself on the topic today. Robert and Lorenzo have prepared an introduction. This will be followed by recorded presentations from a selection of the chapter authors, and then the opportunity for you to ask questions. And I would, as Camilla said, encourage you to put questions in the Q&A at any time, and then we will moderate them. Before I hand over, I would like to thank the EASA, European Association of Social Anthropologists Network, for supporting the book launch, and particularly the conveners, Nikki Wengink and Filippo Calvo, for this support. On that note, Robert and Lorenzo, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, for your introduction. Thank you to the Nordic Africa Institute for the organization of this event, and thank you to those who join us today. This edited volume, The Anthropology of Resource Extraction, is an attempt to consolidate and further develop this growing field of anthropological inquiry. Indeed, in recent decades, anthropological studies focused on resource extraction have expanded significantly. In this regard, one could say that anthropological scholarship on extraction has been an exploding field that has kept pace with the significant growth of extractive practices themselves. Resource extraction is more than ever a global, planetary affair, subsuming increasingly large volumes of earth, land surface, and numbers of people. The accelerated growth of extraction is not likely to slow down, on the contrary. As a consequence, understanding the wide variety of dynamics that are connected to extraction seems to be more pertinent than ever before. Yet, many of the dynamics that inform how resource extraction is entangled in social, political, economic, and physical environments, and how a wide variety of actors attempt to shape this entanglement are left unaddressed or even obscured. The anthropology of resource extraction tries to fill this gap. It embeds resource extraction in the particular sets of histories and social, political, and economic conditions of specific localities, and places its social relations front and center, to use Gilbert Topper and Rajak's expression. In doing so, the anthropology of resource extraction serves, to quote Jerry Jacka's annual review, I quote, to document and critically theorize the interplay of capital, corporations, states, and place-based livelihoods, and the impact extraction has on the environment. End of quote. In the broadest terms, we will add the anthropology of resource extraction interrogates the diverse range of shapes that resource extraction takes and how it is entangled in and affects specific environment, livelihood, and relationship. Ultimately, it aims to contribute to understanding the manifold dimensions of life in a contemporary world by factoring in the role played by resource extraction.
At this point, it is important to clarify what we mean by resource extraction. In its most ordinary understanding, extraction refers to the process of removing something, especially by force, or the most relevant in our case, the process of removing a substance from the ground or from another substance. Recently, some scholars have extended the understanding of extraction in ways that foreground the logics, the ideologies, and inequalities that underpin it, and more broadly, capitalism, thereby directing attention to the idea of extractivism. In the wake of this literature, scholars have also used the terms neo-extractivism or new extractivism to account for more specific developments observed in some South American countries since the early 2000s. The terms extractivism and extraction, however, are also increasingly applied to domains beyond the extraction of minerals. These include agriculture, finance, logistics, fishing, and tourism. In fact, the usage of these terms is becoming so widespread that Zeeman and Wenzel critically point out that extractivism, and I'm quoting, has quickly become the name for every process and practice through which value is generated for capitalism, end of quote. However, there are important differences between the social, economic, material, and political worlds of a miner extracting a mineral resource from the underground, a financial analyst or a digital miner using complex algorithms to extract data, a member of an indigenous community whose heritage is extracted by foreign tourists, or a literature researcher extracting information from an archive. Considering these differences, some scholars have pointed out the potential risk of metaphorical inflation and loss of analytical precision when applying a more metaphorical usage of the notions of extractivism and extraction. Our departure point is therefore a more literal approach to resource extraction. The removal of non-renewable resources, metallic and non-metallic minerals, oil, gas, and coal included, and the various social, political, economic, legal, and technical processes involved. This approach implies that while we limit, so to speak, ourselves to the acts or practices of resource extraction, we also open up to a wide variety of dynamics and effects that can be revealed through an ethnographic lens or an ethnographic analysis of the lived and embedded experiences, hopes, desires, wishes, plans, concerns, and worries of the actors involved in resource extraction. We believe that this approach offers a framework that effectively and productively delineates resource extraction as a field of anthropological study.
Aside from its aim to consolidate and further develop the anthropology of resource extraction, this volume intends to function as a sort of companion, examining and indicating past and future directions taken in each of these focus themes. The 12 chapters in this volume are a selection of what we and the authors consider key themes in the anthropology of resource extraction, either due to their long history of being at the center of studies of extraction or because they are forcefully emerging. Of course, we are far from believing that they represent all or the only key themes that one could possibly distinguish. Yet we believe that this volume offers insight into a broad range of debates and extensive part of the anthropological literature on resource extraction. We do so by combining the approaches taken in review articles and editorial collections. Indeed, while annual reviews are typically cross-topical and cross-regional, an editorial collection typically focuses on a combination of specific region, topics, and/or materials, our volume approaches the literature by focusing on several key themes that cut across regions and materials. As we are reaching the end of this brief presentation, it's also important to stress that the anthropology of resource extraction did not and will not develop in isolation from insights generated elsewhere. The ways in which we engage in debates about materiality, verticality, technology, environmental impacts, kinship, and capitalism, to name but a few, are always related to how these debates are approached in other thematic fields in and beyond anthropology. One must therefore not be surprised to read discussions involving the work of geographers, political scientists, or historians. We therefore also encourage scholars with other disciplinary backgrounds to read this volume, of course, not least because with its in-depth attention to actual places, actual people, and its outlook on the world from below and from within, anthropology offers distinctive and critical insights.
To conclude, we hope that this book will stimulate further reading, further questioning, and the further development of new ideas and the revisiting of old ones, ultimately advancing our understanding of this phenomenon in which we are all, albeit in highly different and highly unequal ways, entangled, resource extraction. We will now move on to show you a video presentation about the book's chapters. As you may have noticed, the volume consists of 13 chapters. Aside from the introduction, this concerns a chapter on the topic of corporations by Elana Schiever, on development by myself, on environmental change by Mark Nuttall, on governance by Jeroen Couvelier, Sarah Gene and Boris Verbrugge, on materiality and substances by Elizabeth Ferry, on mine workers by Benjamin Rubbers, on positionality and ethics by Nick Bainton and Emilka Skripek, on sustainability by Cristiano Lanzano, on technology by Lorenzo D'Angelo, on the underground by Sabine Luning, on water and conflict by Fabiana Lee and Teresa Velasquez, and an afterword by myself and Diana Rajak. The videos we will show you represent most of these chapters and are prepared by the authors themselves. After the video presentation, we will resume our discussion with comments and reflections from our invited speakers, Jessica Smith and Jerry Jacka. Our technical host will now start the video.
For hunting for gold in the Americas to prospecting for copper in Oceania, the search for subsurface resources has led corporations into every part of our planet. For almost a century now, anthropologists have documented the consequences of corporate extraction for people around the world. I'm Elana Schiever, and my chapter traces the history of anthropological scholarship on companies in the energy, minerals, and other extractive industries, highlighting the central concerns, significant insights, and crucial interventions of this work. Many of the places that corporations have gone in search of resources are the same places where anthropologists have traveled to conduct their research. Yet the majority of early anthropologists excluded extractive operations from their ethnographies to portray timeless, isolated cultures. This began to change in the 1930s, when anthropologists documented how colonial mining operations produced social change across the global South. These studies highlighted the importance of corporate paternalism in shaping the lives of workers and their families. In the second section of the chapter, I show how extractive corporations have been instrumental in developing and extending neoliberal forms of capitalism. Next, I scrutinize corporate social responsibility, a key feature of how extractive companies continue to operate today. Finally, I explore the impact of legal definitions of the corporation on the extractive industries. Despite the shifts in foci and theoretical lens, anthropological scholarship has continued to reveal the many ways in which extractive corporations both shape their social and material environments and are shaped by them. Corporate power does not simply emanate from extractive companies' financial might, but from the complex webs of people, materials, money, technology, and knowledge that they weave together. This scholarship has led me to conclude that we should conceptualize extractive corporations as potent, yet contingent, effects of capitalist processes, rather than as the invincible agents of capitalism. Thank you.
Resource extraction has long been considered fundamental to economic growth and social progress. Often, these trajectories of progress are framed in terms of development and are clearly articulated in national and international development policies. While these policies can take different approaches, for example in terms of resource ownership and control, the extraction of natural resources is key in all of them. Anthropologists have extensively analyzed the complex relationship between extraction and development. This chapter discusses this body of work in 3 sections. The first section focuses on the anticipations and dreams of progress that do not only characterize policy documents, but also feature in the lives of people living in environments where extraction takes place, or is anticipated to do so. These anticipations of progress, perhaps finding a big diamond and becoming a millionaire, shape the actions and interactions of individuals and groups of actors. The second option contrasts anticipations of progress with the oftentimes disillusioning realities. As development opportunities are typically linked to revenue flows, this section discusses the limitations of such flows. It foregrounds how power relations and inequalities guide practices of redistribution, such as unfold in situations depicted here, and how this affects who stands to benefit and who stands to lose. The third section zooms in on initiatives that are designed to increase extraction's development contributions. By taking free, prior and informed consent, CSR and public-private partnership as examples, the latter two depicted on these pictures, this section centralizes questions such as development on whose terms, to quote Gilbert and Banks, and development for whom. In all of these domains of analysis, anthropologists situate extraction-led development in the specific complex environment in which it materializes. In doing so, anthropology draws attention to extraction's promises and problems, its politics, practices and ambiguities, and the inequalities and skewed power relations that inform the deeply unequal distribution of benefits and costs.
How are mining signs governed? Who owns the land? Who captures the rent? Who decides and who mobilizes labor?
Such questions have tempted anthropologists for a long time. In this chapter, we present a review of their work, which has addressed multiple levels of interconnected governance, multiple governing bodies, and multiple normative orders. At the transnational level, the focus has mostly been on private forms of governance, such as CSR or mineral certification. But these have also been analyzed as a tool used by the global north to maintain control in the global south. At the national level, most states favor large-scale mining and protect the interests of foreign capital. However, growing frustration over the lack of economic benefits trickling down has triggered policy shifts in some countries towards neo-extractivism and increased state control, and in some cases even a stronger emphasis on developing ASM into a more productive sector. At the local level, governance is the product of an interaction between the state and various other actors, including traditional or customary authorities, landowners and financiers, and militia groups. The field of anthropology has offered rich empirical descriptions of such governance arrangements, using analytical lenses such as pluralism, hybridity, or the frontier.
The key question when analyzing such governance arrangements, in the end, is who benefits and who loses.
The chapter portrays an ongoing process of hybridization, whereby distinctions between formal and informal, modern and traditional, state and non-state, and local, national and transnational governance are becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. While this process of hybridization creates opportunities, for instance for artisanal and small-scale miners, there is also ample evidence that structurally power remains in the hands of global capital.
Hi everybody, my name is Elizabeth Ferry. I'm from Brandeis University, and it's my pleasure to give a brief overview to my chapter, Materiality and Substances, which is a part of the volume, The Anthropology of Resource Extraction. After a brief introduction, my chapter falls into three unequal parts. The first one, it focuses on materiality in early anthropologies of extraction, in which I argue that although there was no clearly consolidated anthropology of mining or self-consciously framed use of materials, that a number of studies that I discuss through their rich ethnography provide opportunities for thinking about materiality and substances in exciting and generative ways. I then pass to the body of the chapter, in which I focus on the ways in which the contemporary anthropology of resource extraction that emerged in the 21st century, when there was a real theorization of resources and a mobilization of thinking about materiality in all kinds of areas of social theory. I note that many of the exciting studies that fall within this period could be categorized according to a variety of these themes. I focus on them really just to give a sense of how this work within what we can describe as the anthropology of resource extraction speaks to so many different contemporary conversations. And finally, I look to some of the future directions of the anthropology of resource extraction, of mining, and particularly of materiality and substances within it. I focus both on the development of new technologies and regimes of financialization, including blockchain, VR, AR, and the emergence of new areas of extraction, such as the undersea and the outer space. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this exciting volume.
My chapter reviews some of the most prominent ethnographies on industrial mine workers since the 1950s. To do so, it attempts to identify the problems their authors have addressed and characterize the approaches they have developed to analyze them. This exercise led me to point to different paradigmatic shifts in the study of mine workers since the 1950s. In the Copper Belt, after the Second World War, their presence in the mines was understood as a problem of adaptation to modernity. In South Africa and Latin America in the last quarter of the 20th century, this issue of adaptation was redefined to give place to a new approach in terms of class cultures. Finally, in a more recent literature on mining project in the 21st century, the interest of researchers seemed to have shifted again from a focus on class to a broader reflection on the work of mining capitalism. As I argue in the conclusion, this approach has still much to offer in terms of new research perspectives. My analysis shows the insights provided by these different works and points to the changes that have occurred in the ways workers' cultures have been understood by anthropologists. So the ethnographies of mining workers reviewed in the chapter can be read as opening a window on broader theoretical shifts in anthropology since the middle of the 20th century. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Nick Bainton. I'm calling in from Australia. Thanks for having me here. I'm really pleased to be able to have the opportunity to say a few words about our chapter on positionality and ethics in the anthropology of resource extraction. We are now living in the mineral age, where the global economy and our daily lives are thoroughly entwined with the extraction and exploitation of natural resources. Making sense of these resource encounters and relations requires creative ways of researching extractive processes and methods capable of engaging diverse sets of actors and interests across contested terrains. Different situations may require different positional stances, which in turn may require different methodological approaches. In this chapter, we summarise some of these positions and the ethical implications of these ethnographic engagements in resource extraction contexts. Recognising that new positions are continually emerging, these positions can overlap, and that many anthropologists move between them over the course of their career as they investigate extractive effects.
When working on this chapter, we reflected on our own diverse experiences as anthropologists working in the context of resource extraction, as well as those of other anthropologists. We considered the implications that different positions create for methodology and knowledge, and outlined ways in which anthropologists have debated the ethical dilemmas posed by working in these contested spaces. Among the great diversity of positions and experiences, there seems to be a consensus that regardless of their positional stance, anthropologists are responsible for effects of their work and engagements. They are also responsible for the relationships and networks they have shaped and mobilized to conduct their work. This responsibility does not end with the completion of fieldwork or a research contract, as the case might be, but is extended by the traces their work and presence leave behind in resource arenas, including professional and personal relations and obligations, as well as the actual research outputs.
In 2002, The Earth Summit of Johannesburg approved a document that made an explicit reference to the contribution of mining, minerals and metals to sustainable development. It recommended efforts to promote transparency and accountability and to enhance the participation of stakeholders such as local and indigenous communities and women. At the time, the notion of sustainability had gained hegemony in the field of international development, but it had also received criticism for its vagueness and for its tendency to be appropriated by different actors for different purposes. Sustainable mining, as an expression, sounded to many like a contradiction in terms, a corporate oxymoron, to quote Stuart Kirsch. Yet it began to materialize in a series of initiatives, protocols and regulations that aimed at mitigating the negative social and environmental impacts of the extractive sector. And probably because anthropologists do like contradictions, they began to document the different forms assumed by the mining sustainability nexus. In this chapter, I review a part of the anthropological literature on some of these forms. Environmental impact assessments, for example, where ecological risks are evaluated and calculated with standardized methods. Corporate social responsibility, where companies set up programs and initiatives in favor of local communities. Fair mining, where voluntary alliances are built between consumers, retailers, and producers in order to shape a more inclusive value chain. These attempts to operationalize the notion of sustainability generate discourses and practices that highlight the multiple understandings of the concept and the contradictory interests at play. In a second section of the chapter, I suggest to expand the notion of sustainability in the light of growing anthropological interest in time, temporality, and the future. An increasing number of studies look at how, in different contexts and societies, rhythms of work and the pace of extraction are defined in relation to scarcity or to the possibility of resource depletion. The discovery of new reserves, the anticipation of mine closure, the imagination of post-oil or post-mining futures all bring us back to the core of what sustainability ultimately is if we reinterpret it in a less normative way. That is, a shared view of desirable futures, a call to intergenerational justice, a reflection on the legitimacy and the viability of certain human endeavors and lifeways, whether they are maintained or forced to change.
Hi everyone, my name is Lorenzo D'Angelo. My chapter highlights how mining technology is the result of creative combinations of heterogeneous technical and non-technical elements, which often have a high degree of mobility. Knowledge, experiences, tools, people, and ideas travel across time and space, and as they travel, some can be partly forgotten, perhaps to be rediscovered later. Often they combine with other technologies and experiences in ways that are not always predictable. For this reason, this chapter promotes a dialogue between anthropology and other disciplines to show how these technological combinations arise, as well as how mining technologies contribute to shaping not only specific environments, but also miner subjectivities and relations of class, gender, and race. The chapter is made of three main sections. The first section shows through different examples, focusing in particular on gold mining, that technological changes can have social effects on social structures, gender, and generational dynamics. The second section examines a central issue for miners, namely the efficiency of the techniques and tools used to extract natural resources. In this section, I use the example of the sieve used by artisanal diamond miners to explain some paradoxical aspect of this efficiency. The third section focuses on miners' knowledge and technical skills, on gender and on the bodily aspect of this relationship with mining technologies. The chapter concludes with some consideration on the most recent technological developments related to deep seabed mining, asteroid or space mining, and the uses of biotechnology to make extractive activities more efficient and, so to speak, green. Thank you. I hope you will enjoy reading this book.
This chapter on the anthropology of the underground takes as its point of departure the vertical turn. the recognition in different disciplines that we need to move from a flat to an in-depth perspective. This allows to study new terrains and see new connections, for instance in the relations between underground extraction and high-rise buildings in urban landscapes. The attention for in-depth earth matters has been fueled by debates on the Anthropocene, which highlights the interplay between geological characteristics and society. Critical moves in terms of subterranean Anthropocene and Black Anthropocenes underline the importance of linking spatial verticalities to social verticalities. The chapter specifies the anthropological contribution to these scholarly developments by emphasizing our discipline's trademarks, a focus on social diversity and pluralities and ways of knowing. Anthropologists scrutinize the ontological underpinnings of knowledge systems, scientific and otherwise, and study how the subterranean is visualized and objectified, but also attributed with agency. In these knowledge practices, the issue of visibility is key. How to know what is invisible beneath our feet, how to make the underground wealth into an extractable resource, how to infrastructure tapping into the underground. These questions are examined by presenting innovative ethnographic work focusing on governance, mining companies and work practices. Ethnographic approaches to governance deal with the implications of surface and subsurface layering of property rights in national laws, but also with the development beyond national territories, for instance in deep-sea mining. The underground dimensions of mining corporations are exemplified in ethnographies on speculation in order to attract investors or to influence public debates. How the underground is seen, mapped and worked by mining engineers and laborers of mining companies brings out issues of agency and materiality. As Ralston shows, miners inhabit a work environment that they themselves create. But mining materials too have affordances which act upon miners while working. In all, the chapter underscores that the anthropology of the underground rocks. Thank you.
Our chapter examines why water has become a key concern in recent conflicts over resource extraction in various parts of the world. We show how water gets drawn into local and transnational activism, how it changes corporate strategies for engaging with communities, and why it has become an important focus in the anthropology of resource extraction. To situate the role of water, we begin with an exploration of the political and economic shifts in countries where mineral conflicts have proliferated in recent decades. The rise of new geographies of extraction have led to the expansion of the mining frontier, producing tensions as different actors compete for power, authority, and right to govern resources. We use the concept of water infrastructures to encompass the material, social, and political relationships that shapes water conflicts in mining regions. Water has become a contested terrain through which engagement and resistance occurs. We explore how water emerges as the material substance with competing meanings and values, including sacred or spiritual connections to bodies of water that have become powerful symbols associated with the defense of life. Some scholars also suggest that water should be treated as a relation that connects people to places, and that the connections that water creates can make it a catalyst for political action. How people experience the effects of mining, including water pollution and a loss of water source, can shape the outcomes of negotiations, lawsuits, and claims for compensation. In our own research, we have also seen how grassroots movements mobilize expert knowledge and legal strategies to support their claims. This suggests that the defense of waterways and landscapes in mining conflicts is inextricably linked to the defense of rights and sovereignty. Concerns over water and the environment have changed the nature of activist and corporate responses to the conflicts, opening up new questions and directions for future research.
Thank you very much, authors who have contributed some really nice insights into your chapters, which I very much enjoyed reading. I'd like to turn now to Professor Jessica Smith from Colorado School of Mines, an anthropologist herself. Jessica, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to offer some comments on this really excellent collection. In the midst of a boom on scholarship on natural resource extraction, this book highlights the unique contributions of anthropology. foregrounding how resource extraction is experienced and how competing interests and power disparities shape those experiences. While reading about the social and environmental casualties of mining and oil and gas production can often feel dishearteningly predictable, what is critical about this collection is that it breaks open what is so frequently represented as an extractive logic to reveal the complex agencies at work within them. In this way, Shepard's chapter on corporations sets an excellent tone for the book as a whole. Rather than treating these complex entities as pathological individuals, she shows the benefit of theorizing the corporate effect and the appearance of uniformity as an accomplishment, given the competing interests and enactments of the corporate form on an everyday basis. She asks, quote, what if, instead of seeing corporate executives as kings who rule from their place at the pinnacle of society, we conceive of them as precariously balanced atop an unstable structure? This is important because that unstable structure has been characterized by an increasing dispersion of responsibility, as extractive corporations have shifted from directly producing resources themselves to managing complex networks of subsidiaries, contractors, and subcontractors. This raises the question, if we view corporations as contingent, is there at least a little room to enact them differently? The contributors all express different levels of skepticism and hope for doing so. So in the rest of my comments, I'd like to pick up on the last sentence of the conclusion and center them around the question of responsibility. Responsibility comes to matter in the book in at least 3 different ways: of companies to the people and places where they operate, of anthropologists to the public, and of anthropologists to our interlocutors. In this sense, we'll start with Piper's excellent chapter on development, as this is a cornerstone of companies' self-defined social responsibility. He shows that fostering development is a technique of governance that allows extractive activity to proceed, presenting a moral case for natural resource production. For him, the value of anthropology is to, quote, counter hegemonic narratives that uncritically position extraction as a development panacea or as a devastating curse, and ultimately to reach a better understanding of how local lives and life worlds shape and are shaped by extraction-led development. Massive environmental changes are one of the key checks on the industry's claims to sustainable development. Nuttall's chapter provides a thorough literature review on how places are made extractable and how new frontiers are created. He pays attention to the epistemic violence that occurs in the way that scientific knowledge is used to design and legitimize resource development projects, privileging the expertise of the company and its mining engineers and geologists over indigenous relational ontology. Leon Velasquez showed that water is one of the key dimensions in which environmental and social conflicts happen. They lay out 5 ways in which water comes to matter: as a biophysical material whose quality and quantity are contested, as the focus of negotiation and compensation, as a relation, as a multiplicity, and as a catalyst for political action. I've been particularly inspired by Fabiana's work theorizing the different ontologies of water that frustrate engineers' attempts to make them commensurable, as well as the different ways that exist of assessing water quality, pollution, and loss between engineers and people such as campesinos. Corporate responses to environmental conflicts has been the widespread adoption of sustainability speak as a way to shore up their public image. Lanzano's chapter traces the proliferation of techniques for assessing sustainability, showing that environmental impact assessment and other devices shape how we think about risk, especially as technically manageable by companies. Rather than accepting responsibility, these devices lay the groundwork for companies' disengagement from the social and environmental consequences of their activities. They reinforce inequalities, marginalize ways of living, and silence other ways of knowing and talking about the environment. In this way, both corporate social responsibility and fair trade efforts end up reinforcing private governance. Cuvelier, Guinin, and Verbruch's chapter theorizes the hybridization of governance, whereby distinctions between formal and informal, modern and traditional, state and non-state, and local, national, and transnational governance are becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. I was particularly taken by their example of artisanal and small-scale mining as a case of legal pluralism. They ask, how can people exercise agency in an attempt to reshape governance arrangements to their own advantage? And they end by calling more attention to labor, such as the increasing segmentation of the large-scale mining workforce. Rubber's chapter on industrial mine workers is an original and important synthesis of otherwise disparate work. He shows that an early focus on labor as it related to processes of modernization rural-urban migration and the making of class cultures has faded away, with a few exceptions. Brajak's excellent work on labor governance as a key technique of CSR, and some of my own scholarship. He argues that this shift away from thinking about labor has been problematic because we're missing out on big changes in the organization of work, including flexibilization, as well as greater understanding of broader transformations in the industry, such as the changing geology of mining, its environmental impact, the mechanization of production, and the financialization of the industry. He calls for more research with middle managers and folks like engineers, which I couldn't agree with more. He ends by one of the big questions that the chapter raises for me is what it would mean to analyze industrial mine workers and artisanal miners in the same analytic frame. I don't see that happening very much. D'Angelo's chapter also calls for more attention to a key area of extractive industries that's been under-theorized by anthropologists, and that's technology. He presents a resolutely socio-technical analysis of mining and provides creative attention to how technologies such as metal detectors can reinforce, reproduce, and sometimes change gender relations. He shows that technologies and engineering knowledge shape what a resource or a mine actually are, and provides reference to Eric Nystrom's really wonderful book, Seeing the Underground, which is also referenced by Luning in her chapter. He shows that efficiency is not neutral or universal, that a wooden sieve used by artisanal miners is uniquely adapted to the materiality of their own labor conditions, and argues that more attention to labor will be key in future directions for the industry, especially the drive for mechanization and automation, which will certainly reconfigure the social contract that precariously exists between companies, communities, and workers. So the anthropologists working on the topics just discussed have an implicit conceptualization of anthropologists' responsibility to the public and to their interlocutors. This primarily rests on theorizing and documenting harm. This raises the question of whether it could also be to participate in doing these industries differently. This would involve different methods, interlocutors, and ethical positions, as Nick and Amelia outline in their chapter on positionality and ethics. They ask, how ought anthropologists assess their responsibility for structurally unjust mining encounters? They summarize a longstanding debate between scholars arguing for neutrality and others, exemplified by Stuart Kirsch, who argue for a more engaged anthropology, saying that it's not possible for anthropologists to be an honest broker when such asymmetries of power exist, as well as polarized perceptions of and investments in mining. They point out that research tends to investigate either the effects of extraction or internal dynamics, that there's been more emphasis on the former because of anthropology's focus on the subaltern and the empathy that's often generated by ethnographic research. They raise the question, which I think is important for us all, about whether we have a responsibility to attend ethnographically to a wider array of actors. This raises the problem of access, including the difficulties of participant observation among relative elites and the potential of corporate capture of research. They conclude by positing if there's a moral or ethical argument for a disinterested anthropology of resource extraction that would open up different kinds of questions, opportunities, and responsibilities. So one of the large questions that the book raises for me is that it brings together very different resource arenas, from large-scale mining, artisanal and small-scale mining, and to a lesser extent, oil and gas. And I wonder what we gain by bringing these together under the same analytic frame and what we lose. I think the book does a really good job of signaling distinctions between large-scale and small-scale mining, but not so much for oil and gas. Many of us, including myself, have moved among these different extractive industries. And I personally have experienced oil and gas as a very different resource arena compared with mining. With few exceptions, they're separate professional executive networks, different temporalities, experiences of labor and financing. I think what brings them together is the subject of Ferry's really generative chapter on materiality and Luning's chapter on the vertical geographies and the underground. Luning positions extraction as a process of embedding and disembedding. Quote, making chunks of earth into commodified resources depends on a double movement of disembedding mining matter from the wider landscape and embedding it in social circumstances. Ferry argues that the kind of deep engagement of anthropological research on mining has allowed us to include far richer descriptions of the process of extraction, the lives, bodies, and sense of miners, cutters, trainers, and consumers, and to provide highly productive theorizations of the enmeshment of the social and the material. She provides an overview of the qualities and affordances of these materials and substances, and the ways that material properties can be mobilized ideologically, especially so as to naturalize particular regimes of value and arrangements of power. So for me, this raises the question how the different material dimensions of mining and oil and gas come to matter for how we theorize resource extraction in general. I was particularly interested in her discussion of the conversion of minerals into commodities and currency, and would appreciate the opportunity to think through what that means for a different kind of conversion that's happening, and that's the mining industry basing its kind of moral justification for expansion in terms of the necessity of minerals for green energy transition. In part, this is part of a much longer process in which companies appropriate the language of their critics, and in which the industry justifies its expansion through providing the material basis or conditions of possibility for everyday life, which I've theorized as an ethic of material provisioning. So for me, this raises the question of what it means to put the anthropology of resource extraction into conversation with a similarly burgeoning field, which is the anthropology of energy. In my own experience, coal mattered differently if I was situating my research in relation to the anthropology of mining or energy. Mining was very helpful for thinking about corporations, the environment, and labor, but thinking about coal as energy brought other kinds of relationships to the fore, from other energy sources to how energy matters in the everyday lives of consumers. And I'll conclude just by signaling that I think there are big opportunities for anthropologists to critically participate in industry's future-making practices, as these are a considerable source of power, especially when they involve fantasies of frictionless mining, from automated haul trucks, so you don't have to deal with the embodied demands of labor, to mining asteroids, which there's no pesky local community to protest extraction in their backyard. This would require expanding our interlocutors and grappling with how we attend ethnographically to a wider array of people whose work puts resource extraction into motion, but whose political otherness confounds our discipline's research sensibilities. Congratulations all.
Jessica, thank you very much for an extremely pertinent and helpful observations. I think let us turn immediately to Jerry Jacka, Professor at, I'm Associate Professor and Departmental Chair at the University of Colorado. Jerry, can I hand to you, please?
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. Hi, everyone. I just was looking through the list of attendees and participants, and it's just, I kind of feel like I know so many of you. We've crossed paths at conferences and workshops, and I just want to say hi to everyone and thank you for being here. And thank you also to Lorenzo and Robert for asking me to pose some questions. Well, thank Jessie also for her amazing recap of the book. Luckily, I'm not going to say the same thing she did. So it'll be kind of nice that in that way, I think. So she did such a wonderful job that I'll briefly touch on some things, but say some other things as well. So first and foremost, I just want to thank Lorenzo and Robert for putting together such a fine volume. I teach a class on the anthropology of resource extraction. I've taught it once, I'm teaching it again next year here. And I just really am looking forward to using this book. It's going to be an amazing resource. And I really like the keywords approach that they did. I think that if it had been set up geographically, it might cloud some of the issues that where they're really trying to get at in exploring what is important in the anthropology of resource extraction. So as the editors note in the introduction, our lives are defined by the implications of living in the mineral age. And quite literally, everything that underpins our society is the outcome of having extracted resources from the planet. So when I first thought of this term, the mineral age, a few years ago, I wasn't even thinking about the near future when societal shifts to low carbon technologies and their attendant minerals will require vastly greater amounts of resource extraction than are occurring today. I've seen estimates that we will need between 2 and 5 times as many minerals as we are currently mining for all of the electric cars, batteries, charging stations, and what have you, as we shift away from fossil fuels in our efforts to mitigate climate change. The paradox is obvious in that the next decades will be defined by our efforts to mine our way to sustainability. So the importance of a book like this one is to examine the role that anthropology can play in documenting and researching the coming resource rush. As well, the editors note that already 90% of all biodiversity loss and global water stress is caused by the extraction and processing of natural resources. And the metals and mineral industries contribute approximately half of all greenhouse gases on the planet. As ethnographers, we are particularly well suited to document the complex processes surrounding resource extraction. This is largely due to the point that the editors make in anthropology's attention to three areas which they kind of parcel out as materialities, imaginations, and social relations. And so while all of the chapters engage with these issues in some manner, each chapter also builds one upon the other to demonstrate the strength, to demonstrate to readers the strength of considering these factors in analyses of extraction. So I'm going to start with materialities first. One of the strengths of our holistic toolkit that investigates these multiple paths of analysis is to show how seemingly concrete entities like corporations are only maintained through their enactments or effects, as Chever discusses, through complex assemblages of people, money, and ideologies. This in turn exposes their weaknesses that can be used against them to promote more sustainable extraction. Nuttall's chapter on the environment highlights the violence of extractivism, its effects on people, place, and planet. And the materiality theory reminds us, forces researchers to pay attention to the agency of resources and not to see them as backdrops to our investigations. Working in a gold mining area of Papua New Guinea, I've always been fascinated with gold's power over human affairs. Technology, as D'Angelo described in his chapter, is a much under-researched area in the anthropology of resource extraction, but he teases out some of the key works in this area, as Jesse earlier indicated. Lee and Velasquez explore the impacts of mining on water resources, since so much mining occurs in conjunction with headwaters of watersheds, and also depends upon water for the processing of minerals. Water, in many cases of resource extraction, serves as the material focus of conflicts over extraction in the environment. In the realm of imaginations, Piper's chapter delineates the ways in which development and national visions of resource extraction lead to ideas of modernization and poverty reduction, yet often hold a number of pitfalls therein too. He rightfully urges readers to think through the potentialities of post-development eras also. While Lanzano's article on sustainability examines some of the material implications of mining companies' attempts to operate more sustainably, I think an especially strong contribution it makes to thinking through mining temporalities and futurisms by thinking through how mining companies create certain expectations in the communities they impact and how anthropologists respond to this. Looning's chapter on the underground asks us to think about the implications of bringing verticality into studies of resource extraction. This line of thinking moves our focus to the land and requires us to conceptualize ontological postulates about life and non-life, as she puts it. So in social relations explores the effects of governance in the mineral extraction world. As in the excellent chapter by Kuverly and colleagues, they focus on different scales of governance from the local to the transnational through their attention to hybridities. There's also Rubber's article in which he presents a viable comparison of the labor process in mining. Bainton and Skripek also encourage us to think about social relations in their chapter on positionality and ethics. As Ballard and Banks remind us in their review of the anthropology of mining, we're not occupying some kind of ethnographic playground, and negotiating how to conduct ethnographies of mining remains quite a challenge. So Pipers and Rajak offer some future directions to ponder as we move forward with our studies. I won't recapitulate those here, but there's also individual authors also discuss some future areas as well. So 6 areas that I think will occupy us for some time are mining temporalities, subterranean entanglements, the planetary mine concept, linkages between anthropologies of capitalism and mine workers, biotechnologies, and waste. I know that many of the authors in this volume have already contributed to the 2018 special issue on mining temporalities, but in line with what Ferry and Limbert and D'Angelo and Pipers have outlined for thinking through resource temporalities, there remains a lot of exciting work. In my current work on mining in Colorado, I've been using these frameworks to think about how we value particular resources and landscapes in different ways in different times, and of course places. I found it very fruitful to think through issues of Native American dispossessions, environmental destruction, and post-mining rehabilitation efforts. The subterranean, as discussed by Looning and Nuttall, also offers huge promise as we link science and technology studies with an anthropology of resource extraction. So I'm currently working on a paper that's organized for this summer at a conference on a panel by Nick Bainton and Milka Skripek using Martin Arboleta's planetary mine concept. Both climate change and the attempts to mitigate it through mining are going to force us to rethink the global with its boundaries and divisions into ways of more planetary thinking. So I think that's going to be a really productive area as well. And I recently reviewed The Illicit Life of Capitalism by Hannah Appel for the journal Africa. And I agree with Reber's assessment that there can be much more research done on the linkages between the anthropology of capitalism and resource extraction labor processes. As for biotechnologies and waste, since 2016, I've been working in communities in Colorado that are currently Superfund sites in which the federal government has had to step in to clean up mines that are producing acid mine drainage. The complexities of cleanup have led me to appreciate in new ways the massive efforts being put forth trying to solve the issue of mine waste and the technologies that are deployed in trying to recover metals in acid mine drainage. And so one of Jesse's comments really struck me, and I think it's quite powerful. I think it's one of the things that's interesting to think about is really the anthropology of the resource extraction of non-energy minerals and the extraction of energy minerals and how different those are, and how really I think that is a future area that we need to think through a little bit more clearly too, is how we're going to deal with some of these different things, because as she was saying, I tend not to even think about energy minerals because they're so different to me in a way of trying to what we want to study and stuff. And so I think that's a very insightful comment. So thank you. Again, I can't stress enough what an amazing volume I think this is. I know it will have a profound effect on the field. So kudos to Lorenzo and Robert and all the authors for putting it all together. Thank you.
Jerry, thank you very much for also some very insightful comments. We're hitting against time, but I'm going to take the liberty, I hope, in running over very slightly. I'd love to have some more questions in the chat. In the meantime, there's a question by Michael Watts. Would speakers like to reflect upon the dynamics and character of the larger trading houses and trading desks, especially the likes of the large independents, Glencore, Trafigura, that seem a relatively weak read in work on extraction, since they combine distinctive corporate forms, their use of offshore financial centers, for example, often are non-publicly traded, and are moving away from that asset-light approach of the past, diversifying into new sectors and activities. And of course, they have historically been beyond reach of the standard neoliberal governance structures. Robert, Lorenzo, would either of you like to take that question?
Yeah, I mean, I can reflect a bit on it. I think it's an excellent question. And anyway, I think there's also another question in the chat that is still open that we could deal with. Yeah, I think not only in work on extraction in general, this is a relatively weak read. I think also, well, in general, in anthropology of extraction, this is an area that is maybe understudied. And of course, we have seen the rise of studies on the internal dynamics of corporations in the last years or in the last decade or so, with anthropologists gaining increasing access to boardrooms, to different kinds of levels of corporations, to managers. And I think this has been excellent development, and this development hopefully is going to continue and extend into these domains. So as Professor Watts mentions, the trading houses, the trading desks. I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and I could imagine that this work, well, to some degree, it's already taking place. I know, for example, that Stuart Kirsch, I'm not sure if he's here, but if he is, he could probably respond. Stuart has also started work on think tanks, on kind of influential bodies that are not directly associated with the practices of extraction, but are certainly part of it. So I think this is development that is taking place now, and that maybe we could also add to the list that Jerry already gave with regard to the future components of an anthropology of resource extraction.
Thank you, Robert. We have a second question that was partly answered by you, Lorenzo, but I think it would be interesting to hear. Andres Ricaldi was asking whether you would consider extending the research to the anthropology of artisanal mining, born from local initiatives in developing countries. And I know you started to answer that, and there was a clarification on what was meant by local initiatives in terms of informal mining entrepreneurs that mine large-scale mining operations, but at micro scale, these entrepreneurs generate wealth that moves directly into the local economy. Be interested to hear your reflections.
Hi, thank you for your question, Andres Ricalde. Hope I'm pronouncing well. I'm not sure I'm interpreting correctly your question, but I think you're pointing a very crucial issue: the relationship between small-scale mining or artisanal small-scale mining and large-scale mining, which is the crucial issue for many anthropologists. Probably more from the perspective of those working on artisanal mining or small-scale mining rather than vice versa from those that are interested in large-scale mining. This is my impression, I might be wrong. So yes, the relationship is, as Jessica mentioned in her introduction, probably is under-theorized, or there's not enough theorization about this. I personally like the notion of articulation, but I feel there are many other possible ways of interpreting and analyzing this relationship. And I again, I want to stress how important it could be developing more research about this crucial and complicated and somehow not so clear-cut relationship between a small-scale and a large-scale mining. And there is a gray zone of relationship and somehow sometimes ambivalent, paradoxical, and contradictory many times, oftentimes. I don't know if other people want to add something about this, or if it's okay for Andre.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. I'm keen to draw authors in of the chapters, and I'm having a technical issue of wondering quite how to do that. Camilla, would you mind helping me? Because what I was wondering is if, I know many of you in the audience, whether you would like to respond to any points that were raised by discussants in the short presentations that were given in response to the book. We can allow you to speak directly. If maybe you put if you'd like to respond, and maybe put your name in the chat in the Q&A function, that we could turn to you. In the meantime, I think there's a very interesting question by Nikki. Congratulations to all the authors. This book is a great feat and a wonderful resource. I wondered about the notion of planetary mine, as this offers interesting new ways for studying resource extraction and perhaps the linkages and commodity chains related to resource extraction. What do the authors or presenters see as new or not so new methodologies for approaching this notion of planetary mine ethnographically? In fact, Jerry, I think this should be a question coming back to you.
Yeah, sure, Eleanor, thanks. Yeah, so I have to admit I'm only about halfway through Martin Arbelay's book, Planetary Mine, but he does lay out in the intro, I think, a pretty clear idea of what he's trying to get at. And this is the sense that some of the divisions that we've been thinking through with terms of globalization, like you know, the developed world, developing world, first world, third world, rural, urban, really are divisions that prevent us from tackling phenomena that we're going to have to tackle, such as things like climate change and the coming mineral resource extraction that's going to be developed out of that. And so what the planetary concept is trying to do then is trying to break that down and realizing that these things, like something like, you know, CO2 in the atmosphere, doesn't care what country you live in. It doesn't care whether you're living in a developed country, developing country, or anything like that. We're all impacted by the amount of CO2 that's in the air. And some of the effects that might come from that, I think we still maybe need to tease out how that's going to impact people, but we know that sea level rise is going to impact New York just as much as it's going to impact Bangladesh. And so I think that it's important to try to think through some of the ways then that these planetary phenomena are going to be impacting us. And so that's really why I kind of been stressing this idea and thinking about it, and I'm trying to think about it in terms of what it's going to mean for a study of resource extraction, because I think one of the things we're going to see also is that areas traditionally closed to mining are going to reopen to mining. And in fact, like I was saying in my comments, I've been working in communities that are post-mining communities, but one of them has just reopened a mine, a silver mine, because of the need for silver for the green energy, or for the green technologies that are going to be coming as we turn away from fossil fuels. And so I think there's just so much work to be done to think about what that's going to mean in terms of when we start seeing mining in national parks, protected areas, right outside big urban centers. I think mining is going to come, it's no longer going to be outsourced in the ways that it has been outsourced from into the developing countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia Pacific and stuff. And it's going to be mining in the United States, in Europe, and places like this.
Thank you, Jerry. Let's turn to another question. Ilana, I can see that you've raised your hand and would like to comment, and I put a point in the chat, but we can spotlight you and have you speak directly, which is much better than me being interlocutor. Please, if you'd like to speak now.
Yes, thank you. I think I just was responding to Michael Watts's excellent point about the ways that trading houses and the financial aspects of the extractive industries have really escaped critical and particularly ethnographic attention. And I think that some work on the anthropology of money and its connection to resources is a fruitful way of thinking about how to bring in these actors into a critical investigation of extraction and the ways that resources turn into money and turn back into resources in all sorts of ways that often escape public attention, particularly because of one of the reasons that Michael Watts brings up, of the fact that they are not publicly traded, they are not situated geographically in the ways that many of those companies have received a lot of attention are situated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilana. Yeah, Elizabeth, I think you also wanted to come in. We can spotlight you and speak yourself, I think.
I think I'm not I'm muted. Am I muted? Can you hear me?
No, you're here. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I also wanted to pick up on, we'll sort of link this question of the planetary mind to Michael's comment and also the what Ilana was just saying about the ways in which, in some ways, the commodity chain conceptualization, which has been enormously productive in revealing certain kinds of things, also makes certain kinds of stories a little harder to see. And one of those stories is the relationship between something like financialization and extraction, because it sort of imagines or nudges towards an imagination of it being production is on the one side and then consumption or use is on some other side. And I think that, one of the ways that Arboleda's work opens that out is through this planetary mind idea, which proposes certain kind of ethnographic possibilities without necessarily being a highly ethnographic work itself, right? And I just wanted to maybe shout out to a few people who are doing work in this area that is very helpful. I can't see the participant list, so I don't know whether they're here or not, but Paul Gilbert in Sussex on financialization, and Mathieu Bollet, who's also, I think, trying to get at some of these issues that Watts is discussing of areas that need more ethnographic attention. Of course, things like Glencore, for the very reason that they are so powerful, are very have a lot of capacity to manage the ways in which they can be studied ethnographically. And so I'm really you know, the people like Bowen and others who are doing that kind of work are really doing a sort of mitzvah to the community of anthropologists studying extraction. But I think really sort of trying to think about the ways that production and consumption are themselves constructs that provide lots of ways of thinking that are generative, but also, you know, make certain stories visible and other stories less visible. And that sort of Arboleda and others are kind of allowing us to begin to think through that in different ways.
Indeed. Yeah, thank you. I see lots of hands. Lorenzo.
I think Robert was raising his hand first.
I'm sure you can go.
Okay, I can go. Sorry, Robert.
Go for it.
I would just very briefly raising again this issue of planetary mind, which are actually very interesting. And I just very short note, considering the methodological consequence of thinking the mind's planetary. And I wonder, it's more a question rather than an answer, whether the individual approach that usual anthropologists have on the fieldwork is still possible when the mind is planetary, our fieldwork is planetary. Somehow, we also briefly mentioned this in the introduction, Robert and I, about the possibility of doing research collaboratively and with the research team larger and larger. Of course, this goes against the possibility of finding foundings for financing this type of research, but I feel that more than ever in the future, probably in the future, we need more collaborative projects among anthropologists working in different localities and so on. And I forgot to mention, as Sarah Guinen in the chat reminded us, that they also wrote a book about global production, and they use this global commodity chains theoretical framework, which is actually very interesting and useful. And thanks for reminding us about this volume recently published. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Robert.
Yeah, thank you. Really a lot of very interesting questions and comments, and thanks a lot for that. I wanted to briefly share a response to 3 items that popped up in the chat. First of all, on the planetary mind, just wanted to draw the attention to also Sabine Luning's chapter on the underground in our volume, which actually briefly reflects on the issue of studying the planetary mind anthropologically and what this anthropological approach could contribute to understanding planetary dimensions of resource extraction. And in this regard, I'm always reminded about what I think is still a key work, and hopefully continues to be a key work in anthropology, Small Places, Large Issues, by Thomas Rieland Eriksen, in which he explains so well and details so well how our focus on small places and the connections between small places can really tell us a lot and reveal a lot about big issues that the world is facing today and in the future. Yeah, just to add to otherwise more detailed and very good responses from our colleagues. Also in relation to the issue of LSM or large-scale mining and small-scale mining, as Sarah pointed out, their book really does that very excellently. I think a lot of work in Africa and also outside of Africa has been done on exactly these small-scale or artisanal mining activities. And here we can, of course, talk about mining and perhaps not about resource extraction in general, because we are pointing here at mineral resources. So a lot of work has been done of that, and it has been one of the key considerations actually in this book to not divide or to not thematically distinguish large and small scale mining, but to really discuss it as part of similar dimensions. And if I think about my own chapter on development, where imaginations of prosperity, these imaginations, they feature in the lives of artisanal diamond miners who use a sieve and a shovel, as Lorenzo talks about in his chapter. They feature in the lives of workers going to the iron ore mine and getting a daily salary. They feature in the global imaginations about the oil wealth. So I think these are some of the also the ideas that bring these skills of work together, aside from the kind of the practices where we can observe relations between small scale and large scale mining. Well, also there's quite a lot of work discussed in the book. I think Alexander's Basil's question is also
I was just about to ask, yes.
Yeah, I think it's also very important, and something Lorenzo and I discussed when we formulated how do we present this kind of field in anthropology. Do we talk about an anthropological field, or is it a thematic field? Is it a theoretical field? I think Anthropology of Resource Extraction draws on so many insights from very well-established fields in anthropology, like anthropology of religion or economic anthropology, political anthropology, that we, correct me if I'm misrepresenting your opinion here, Lorenzo, that we took it rather as a thematic field of study. And the question will be whether it turns into a theoretical field. It's also a question that Alex Gollop poses in his recent encyclopedia entry on the anthropology of extraction, that actually the future will prove whether this develops into, I wouldn't like to say something more, but develops into something else than a thematic field of inquiry, and perhaps indeed in a theoretical field. But I think we are probably not there yet.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'm mindful of time, and we have Cristiano Lanzano, also a contributing author in the audience. Cristiano, would you like to come in and respond to any points that have been made?
Yes, thank you, Eleanor. I wonder if you can hear me. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to add on the line of what others have said on the planetary scale, global scale versus local scale, because I also have not read Martin Arboleda's book on planetary mind, but I think that it is there's several sections of the anthropological and the political economy literature recently on mining industries and resource extraction that points at, for example, the literature on value chains, on global production networks, that also tries to tackle that approach of the global scale of the extractive sector, even in its local manifestations. And I think it points to a recurring aspect in anthropological work as well, of working in local context, but connecting to global questions, as Robert was reminding. And I think it's also important to look at both the material and so commercial, economic, financial collections that connects the different places where we work, but also the global aspect of imagination. And that's something I really encountered in the chapter on sustainability, which is the sort of a global narrative par excellence at this moment, but that has repercussions and reimaginations and reinterpretations at the local level. So I think this is a very pertinent point of reflection that we should look at from different perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristiano. I'm going to wrap up the questions now, and I will be handing back to Lorenzo and Robert for some final words. Just before I do, though, if I could just do a little plug, next week, next Wednesday, we have a joint book launch, 2 books on the copper belt, one by Patience Masusa on the Zambian copper belt, and the other by Miles Lama on the DRC copper belt. So please do join us for this joint book launch next week. But that plug aside, Lorenzo and Robert, would you like to have the last word?
Feel free, Lorenzo. Otherwise, I go.
I will just add to a little thought about what you were saying, Robert, about and responding again to Alexander Baslov. I think one crucial step for us was thinking about the meaning of extraction. What do we mean by extraction? I think that was a crucial step for us to defining our field. there are a lot of literature, very interesting, very excellent and stimulating, challenging literature on extractivism. And we consider how to relate to this huge growing literature and new extractivism and neo-extractivism and so on. And we thought that for us was important to consider extraction in a very simple way, basically as in a literal sense, as extraction as a physical material practice. In this regard, for us, was very important to have a chapter like dedicated specifically on materiality, like the one written by Elizabeth Ferry, which consider precisely the importance, the issue of the physicality, materiality of doing extraction. So I think this was an important point that I wanted to highlight before we conclude this presentation. I think was something important to stress. I don't know, Robert, maybe we can conclude by simply thanking all the authors, or want you had something, because for us it was very, maybe we can mention the fact that we wrote this book during the pandemic. Was very stressful period for all of us, but we thanks also to collaborative, a very stimulating dialogue and debates with the authors. I think we come out with a possibly, hopefully, satisfactory result. And this thanks also to all the authors that contributed and dedicated time to writing their chapters, and was very useful also for us. We learned a lot of things reading through their chapters. Of course, no one can be specialized in everything, and this book is basically a collaborative project in which we put together our brains and we try to offer a synthetic view, a partial synthetic view on the existing literature, because as we stress also in our introduction, we left outside of this book many very interesting topics, many very interesting works. And we sometimes when I read my chapter, I realized that I missed that authors, I forgot to mention that other ones. So as you all know, this kind of little frustration, but this for us it was just a way to kick a debate. Hopefully someone else will continue and will develop more further. And this was what I wanted to say. And thank you again very much to everyone, to all the authors, again, to the organizer of this seminar, and to the participants that are following us today.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Yeah. Would you like to add anything, Robert?
Yeah, just to second what Lorenzo has said, it was really inspiring to work with the authors, to review each other's works. Everybody engaged really so nicely with this volume in indeed a time that was really not easy for many of us. And that continues to be not easy for many of us, because while we are talking here about resource extraction and book publications, people very close to, physically very close to where I'm sitting and to where many of us are sitting are suffering from an invasion and from a war. And I think we need to realize also we're not living in easy times, and many people in this world have difficult circumstances to be with. All the more appreciated that we see so many people in the audience today, that the authors have worked so well in this volume, engaged so nicely. And also Jessica and Jerry, I really appreciate very much your reflections. I think they've been really insightful. Unfortunately, we weren't able to discuss them in detail. I think the topic, Jessica, you raised about the anthropology of energy versus the anthropology of extraction, I think there's a lot to say about it. It's has been a division, sort of a division in anthropology since long. Also when the Anthropology of Resource Extraction Network, or the Anthropology of Mining Network, was founded in EASA. I think it's a topic we can discuss much more. And Jerry, also the topics for further research that you mentioned, yeah, I think they provide so much food for thought. And I also really appreciated the sort of three connecting elements in the in your talk, and that you have observed in our book. So I think to both of you, thanks a lot. for reading our work and engaging with it in so much detail and offering so much more food for thought. This also applies to the audience who has raised questions that we can continue to think about and must continue to think about. Then I can only also say thank you, of course, to EASA for being involved in this launch, to Gold Matters, and especially also to the Nordic Africa Institute, who has organized really this launch so excellently. And also thank you to Eleanor for moderating this event. Very much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think it's a lovely volume which brings together great contribution by different scholars, and I very much hope it will be taken into university teaching and inform scholarship for the coming years. I'd like to mention that there is a flyer, I think, put into the chat on a discount on the book, so always may be helpful. And on that note, I'd like to say goodbye to everyone. And thank you especially Jerry and Jessica for joining us in European time. I hope you can go now and get a coffee. Thank you very much. And goodbye from us at the Nordic Africa Institute. Thank you.
Thanks for the invite. It was wonderful.